And Bruce, you were there coming up in 1987 as we roll on into 1988 as WrestleMania 4 in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The Macho Man defeats Ted DiBiase in the finals of the tournament to decide the new heavyweight champion. It's Macho Man, and as we leave the air of WrestleMania 4, we see three people in the ring, and they're the Macho Man Randy Savage, Hulk Hogan, and Miss Elizabeth. So kind of curious from there, Bruce, this is probably one of the best angles you guys pulled off in your early tenure. Would you agree?
Well, believe it or not, it was actually not just an angle. It was a story that built over an entire year from one WrestleMania to the next WrestleMania with an eye towards the future after that. And the idea was, here's Randy Savage, your new champion. Hulk was kind of passing the torch, if you will, but Hulk was going on doing movies. Hulk was doing some other things. And it was time for a change and to try something else. And Randy was that guy. And it was 1988, WrestleMania 4, and the dawn of a new era and the Macho Man. But at WrestleMania 4, what was really being built at that point was to get to WrestleMania 5.
So did you guys already know that you were coming back to Atlantic City and using the same venue and all that for 5 at that point? Did y'all work out like a 2-for-1 deal with Donald?
You know what? I don't really even remember at that point what that deal was, if there even was a deal for WrestleMania 5. We did have an idea at that point that we were going to go with Randy versus Hulk at WrestleMania 5, with Randy making the switch back to being a heel. And it was the build to Randy being a babyface had started prior to WrestleMania 4, with Randy beating Honky Tonk Man for the Intercontinental Championship, and kind of being, Hulk helping him along the way and getting to WrestleMania 4, and Hulk's eliminated and Randy's the champion, and it put the spotlight on Randy and Liz. And at the time, Randy and Liz were a hot act. I mean, they were a hot act in WWE.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because I think a lot of people forget that the Macho Man was not always a babyface. I mean, in the early WrestleManias, he was a heel. Most people remember his match at WrestleMania 3 with Ricky Steamboat, and he was clearly the heel there. And then he took what seemed like a 1-year hiatus to go babyface for WrestleMania 4, and then he's right back to being a heel for WrestleMania 5, and that will continue with WrestleMania 6 and even 7. So through a lot of his, most of his WWF career, he was a heel. But you mentioned it, so I've got to follow up, because I know you love addressing the rumors and innuendo. Through the years, there has been a wrestling legend that has kind of grown that the only reason that WrestleMania 4 main event worked out the way it was is because on that Saturday night's main event you mentioned with Honky Tonk Man, where he smashed the guitar over his head, supposedly Honky Tonk Man refused to drop the title that night, and that changed the course of history. Now, I know you're going to address this, but I want to get all the details out there. Supposedly, someone was leaving. They wanted to put the Intercontinental title on someone just long enough to go ahead and have Randy win it. Randy was not afforded that opportunity, and the plans for $1 Million Man to be champion at WrestleMania and win the tournament then went out the window, and instead, the $1 Million Man got a $1 Million belt, never got his shot at the big belt. Honky Tonk remained the champion until the summer, and for whatever reason, Macho Man now found his way into the main event. So what really happened with that whole situation?
Well, to tell you what really happened, I think there was a situation where Butch Reed was in the hunt, and Butch Reed was going to be the Intercontinental Champion, defeating Ricky Steamboat. Butch didn't show up for TV. The move was made to the Honky Tonk Man. There were a lot of dominoes that kind of fell all along the way that made it all kind of happen.
And the first domino was Ricky Steamboat, so let me ask on that. What was Ricky's reason for dropping the belt to Butch Reed? If memory serves, he would show up not too long after that in the Jim Crockett promotion again and resume his feud with Ricky Steamboat from earlier in the 80s and people remember the great matches they had in '89. But what was Steamboat's deal? Why was he on the way out there?
Well, Steamboat had asked for his notice, and Steamboat was ready to leave. I think there were some issues with Ricky's wife at the time, and Ricky was unhappy, and Vince didn't like unhappy people around him. So Ricky wanted to leave. Vince gave him his release and allowed him to leave. But Ricky was the champion at the time, the Intercontinental Champion. He had to take the belt off of Ricky
Sure.
to move on. So it was simply one of those situations where Steamboat was unhappy where he was and wanted to move on.
Is it fair to say, because I want to dig into this, because I think sometimes people, automatically think of WCW and the WWF in the Attitude Era, where seemingly guys were leaving the WWF to jump to WCW for more money. That was not the case in 1988 at all. It seemed at the time that there was a clear line that if you went to New York, you made a lot more money. And he's one of the only guys I remember thinking about, or off the top of my head that I can think of, who would have said, you know what, no, I'm leaving and I'm going south for, I assume, more money.
Well, maybe it was. He might have had a promise of more money down south at the time. I don't really know what his motivation was other than he was unhappy where he was. And the opposite was happening more often than not when guys coming from the south to come up and work for the WWF. So it wasn't, okay, we lost one, but we probably gained 4 in the exchange, if you will. But Steamboat just wasn't happy. And Vince is the kind of guy, you're not happy? Go be happy somewhere, or go be unhappy somewhere else.
He said that the reason he left Jim Crockett Promotions and the NWA to go to the WWF originally was because he assumed he was in line for a U.S. title shot and never was afforded that opportunity. And then Tully Blanchard won the belt right away, and he felt like the writing was on the wall as far as Dusty being the booker. But now here he's in a very prominent match at WrestleMania 3 and drops the belt, or doesn't drop the belt, but takes it off the Macho Man, and now just wants to get out of Dodge. And I find that a little weird. You alluded earlier to maybe he had some problems with the wife, and there's lots of rumors and innuendo about that maybe his wife at the time worked to the detriment of his career. Can you add any insight on that?
I just started at the time, so I wasn't involved in a lot of the drama and backstageisms, if you will. So I wasn't necessarily privy to it, but I do know that Ricky wanted to move on. And whether it was pressure at home, Ricky just not being happy with his position, it really is as simple as, I'm unhappy, I want to move on, and he moved on.
So let's get this straight now. So Ricky Steamboat's the Intercontinental Champion. He asked for his release. Vince grants it, and he's probably happy to do so because in Vince's mind, if he was not paying Ricky gobs of money, he would have not assumed that he was a big draw for him, and is probably happy to get him off his books. And Butch Reed is in line for the shot, and Butch Reed was a hell of a performer at the time. And he no-shows some events, so you guys start looking around and just randomly find a Memphis guy and say, oh, we're going to give him this gimmick and put the belt on him.
It wasn't random per se. It was more, Honky Tonk was hot at the time.
Well, but come on now. Let's talk through this. We're going from one of the greatest in-ring performers of all time, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, to the Honky Tonk Man. And at the time, the perception was that the Intercontinental Belt was the quote-unquote workers' title. You had really great in-ring guys. And I understand Honky Tonk Man had white-hot heat. We've talked about it here on the show, I believe, last week against, or when we covered Dusty Rhodes. But is this par for course to go from a Ricky Steamboat type performer with that belt to a Honky Tonk Man? It didn't seem curious to you at the time?
Not necessarily. And I mean, it's funny you say it was a workers' belt. Who says? I mean, because, it's one of those situations. The top worker is the guy that makes the most money and who is usually the champion, the guy, and that was Hogan and then Savage later on in that case. And the Intercontinental Championship was a prestigious title that was kind of the next guy in line, if you will.
Well, I mean, the guys, you ask where that comes from. Well, it comes from in the years prior to that, guys like Pat Patterson or even Tito Santana, Macho Man, Ricky Steamboat, and now Honky Tonk Man. Is that not a game of which one of these is not like the other to you?
Well, but also you take a look at Honky Tonk Man. I do think Honky Tonk was a hell of a worker. He was a guy that worked his gimmick and was able to get heat, carried a lot of heat, and he was the kind of champion that everybody in the arena knew they could beat.
Right.
Every guy sitting in the arena would sit there and go, "Oh, that damn Honky Tonk Man, I'll whoop his ass." And he could squeak by and continue to hold on to that championship no matter who he was against, and he would make the babyface. So that's a valuable guy. That's a valuable champion to have. Much like Ric Flair did his entire
I knew you were going to do that. I knew you were going to do that. Okay, I'm going to move on before I get half hot. So let's get back to it here. Now,
now you want to change the subject.
Honky Tonk. Well, let's not debate the greatness of the Nature Boy Ric Flair and compare him to the fucking Honky Tonk Man.